Hey everybody, this is AP Macro 2015 FRQ question number 1. Let's get to it. It says, assume that the United States economy is operating below full employment. That means we've got a recession, we've got a recessionary gap. A, draw a correctly labeled graph of the long-run average supply, short-run average supply, aggregate demand, and show each of the following. They want the current equilibrium output and price level, labeled at Y1 and PL1. Okay guys, I've already started the ASAD model, got the basic stuff. We've got an SRAS curve that's upward sloping, and just so you know why, that's because nominal wages are sticky in the short run. That's why it's upward sloping. We've got an AD that is downward sloping. The vertical axis is the price level. The horizontal axis, we have a choice. We call it real output or real GDP. All right, I tend to put real GDP. And guys, these two curves are what I like to always put on my graph first because they are giving us the equilibrium output, the current level of output. So bring this down. This is called the equilibrium real GDP, all right? So equilibrium output or equilibrium real GDP. Then bring this over. Oh, I'm sorry, they don't want it E1. Always go with their labeling. So, sorry, they didn't want it YE, they wanted Y1. Sorry about that. And then bring this over, price level 1. All right, we got most of it, but it says it wants the LRAS and that full employment level of output also. I like to put my LRAS curve as a red line because, guys, I think that more as a reference line than anything else. It's showing us that in the long run, we'll always make it back to full employment output, and therefore it is a vertical line. And I need to put that vertical line to the right of where we're currently at because, again, we are in a recession, right? If we're in a recession, our current level of output is less than our full employment level of output. So, just to make sure we're clear, where we anchor this LRAS curve, and when I say anchor on the horizontal axis, is always at full employment level of output. Okay, so Y at full employment level of output, LRAS, and now we can see that recessionary gap. That's the recessionary gap, the distance from there to there. And I think that's everything that gives us all the points we need. B, assume that the Federal Reserve targets a new federal funds rate to reach full employment. Should the Federal Reserve target a higher or lower federal funds rate? So the should aspect has to do with the recession. We're in a recession, so what should the Fed do? The Fed should do easy monetary policy, right? They want to bring interest rates down. The federal funds rate is an interest rate, so they want to bring it down. Guys, that's about as simple as you need to make it. That's why they want to bring that interest rate down. But just to go a little bit further, the federal funds rate, what is it? It is the interest rate that banks charge each other for reserves, okay? So the idea is banks with excess reserves lend out the reserves on an overnight basis to banks that are deficient in reserves. They want to lower that federal funds rate so that it makes the penalty of being deficient less because and that's weird, yeah, they want to make the penalty of being deficient less because they don't want banks scared to be inefficient because what they want banks to do is lend out more, right? We're in a recessionary gap, they want more lending. They also want the benefits of having excess reserves to be less, okay? That's affecting the supply of federal funds. So that's why they want to bring down that federal funds rate because they're trying to stimulate lending. And guys, they want banks to be lending out their required reserves. So again, the easy answer is we have a recessionary gap. The Fed wants to bring interest rates down. What interest rates? Pretty much all interest rates. It wants to bring down. The federal funds rate is an interest rate. Bring it down. But I wanted to give you a little explanation on top of that. All right, moving on to C. Given the Federal Reserve's action you identified in Part B, draw a correctly labeled graph of the money market and show the effect on the nominal interest rate. Okay, so how do you change the federal funds rate? You change it with open market operations, and again, we're trying to make the federal funds rate go down, so we're going to do open market purchases, which again is easy monetary policy. I've got my money market started over here. Guys, the money supply, well, actually, before I even get to a curve, I should probably look at my axes, right? This is the nominal interest rate, that's the cost of holding money. All right, here's my quantity of money, which I like to put as the quantity of M1. The vertical line is the money supply. Guys, the quantity of the money supply does not change with the nominal interest rate because it's the Fed that is determining the amount of the money supply. All right, so it is vertical. So important to make sure you draw the money supply vertical. Here's my money demand. I draw it in this kind of funky, kinked way to remind myself there's two components of money demand, the transaction demand for money, which is our demand for money to do basic transactions, and then also our asset demand for money, which is this additional demand for money, kind of for cushion or convenience sake. And this is our original interest rate, or our original nominal interest rate. Again, we're going to do open market purchases. This is expansionary monetary policy. We're going to buy bonds from the banking sector to put reserves into the banking sector, which will also, remember, drive that federal funds rate down, right? That will get the money supply curve to shift to the right. So let's draw that money supply shifting to the right. And we want to drive down the cost of holding liquid assets, right? We're going to drive down the cost of holding money. Oops, that's not E sub 0, that's E sub 1. Because we want people to hold more money, we want to hold more liquid assets, we want to spend more liquid assets. So this is the Fed increasing that money supply. Hopefully that makes sense to you. Make sure we got all those points, we got the correctly labeled, and the impact on the nominal interest rate. They always want to know the impact on the nominal interest rate. When you do a money market, guys, and pretty much every time we say show the impact on the nominal interest rate, we got that. It's going down. All right, D. The policymakers pursue a fiscal policy rather than monetary policy. Okay, so now we're not going to do monetary policy, we're going to do fiscal policy. Assume that the marginal propensity to consume is 0.8 and the value of the recessionary gap is 300. Okay, so a few things. They just told us the distance from here to here is 300. I think it's 300 billion probably. So I'll put 300 billion. And they told us that the MPC is 0.8, which means the MPS is 0.2, because when you add these two together, you get 1, right? Because there's only two things we can do with our disposable income. We can either use it towards consumption or savings. And remember, what is the MPC? It is the delta C over the delta DI. And what is the MPS? It's the delta S, delta savings over delta DI, right? If there's only two things we can do with our disposable income, these two things need to equal 1. That's how I knew the MPS was 0.2. D1. If the government changes its spending without changing taxes, okay, so they're going to increase government spending, they're not going to change taxes to eliminate the recessionary gap, calculate the minimum required change in government spending. Now, I want to talk about this word minimum. Why they have to throw that in there is because, guys, usually we're going to have to actually increase government spending by more than what we're going to find in this problem, because SRAS is often drawn upward sloping. And so here's my point, guys. Don't lose me on this. When they say minimum, they're actually saying the way to translate the term, when AP says minimum, the way to translate that is if the SRAS curve was horizontal. That's right. If the SRAS curve was horizontal. That's what they're saying when they say minimum. Now let me show you why that is. If the SRAS was horizontal, all we would have to do is shift the AD curve, let me put that in right here, by the amount of that recessionary gap. Okay, did you follow that? Hopefully you did. Let me say that one more time. When they say minimum, and they're going to say minimum all the time, that's what they're always going to do. They're going to make the math really simple. Guys, what they're really saying, the way I would translate it is, if the SRAS curve was horizontal. If the SRAS curve was horizontal, hey, then all we have to shift AD to close that gap is by the amount of the gap. Remember, AD is total spending. We're only going to need this much of an increase in total spending. Remember, guys, if that SRAS was upward sloping, right, the way it was, that shift in AD right there, that $300 billion shift in AD, would change real GDP by less than 300, okay? So hopefully that makes sense to you. So we got what's the minimum we need to change? AD, which is total spending, 300 billion. Now, the next question is, what is our spending multiplier? The spending multiplier is 1 over the MPS, which is 1 over 0.2. We already know what the MPS is. 0.2 goes into 1 5 times, which means it's 5. And I like to write my spending multiplier always as a proportion to remind myself what it's telling me is for every initial change of $1 in spending, I'm going to get a total or amplified change in spending of $5. Okay, now with that in mind, how much do we need total spending to change? Remember, AD is total spending. We need total spending to change by 300. So 5 over 1 equals a total change of 300 billion. We need the initial change in spending. What's the initial change in government spending we need to get a total change of 300. If we solve this, we're going to find out it's 60 billion, right? 60 billion, so D1, 60 billion. Next, if the government changes taxes without changing government spending to eliminate the recessionary gap, will the minimum required change in taxes be greater than, smaller than, or equal to the minimum required change in government spending in Part D1 explained? Okay, they're actually not asking you to calculate a value. Here's the idea, guys. When we change government spending, which can be labeled government spending or government purchases, those can be used synonymously. When we change government spending, government purchases, guys, that goes directly into the product market. We get the full amount that we change government spending to change nominal GDP initially, okay, to change AD initially. We're going to get that whole amount, making it into the product market and buying goods and services. If we change taxes by $300 billion, and what would we do? We would lower taxes by $300 billion. Well, that would change DI by $300 billion, right? It would increase DI, disposable income, by $300 billion. But what would be our initial change in spending? Well, some of it would leak out to savings, right? And something less than $300 billion would make it here. And so our initial change in spending would be less than $300 billion. So to be clear, we change government spending by $300 billion, all $300 billion makes it to the product market. If we change taxes by $300 billion, once again we're lowering it, disposable income goes up by $300 billion, but households are going to save some of that. Something less is going to make it to the product market, and this is where spending is happening. Okay, so some amount less than $300 billion is going to make it there. What does this mean, guys? It means that we need to change taxes by more than we change government spending to have the same impact. And guys, what I just said, you can't explain in words. And I think the big thing is, hey, government spending goes right in the product market, and we buy that gives us our full change in spending of $300 billion. Tax changes, some portion is going to get saved before it ever gets spent, and that's the key. Some portion is going to get saved before it ever gets spent. I have to tell you, there is a simpler way to do it, but I don't love it because it requires you memorizing a formula, and I hate memorizing formulas. But you could just compare the spending multiplier, which is 5, to this thing called the tax multiplier, which I don't love. But anyhow, the tax multiplier is the negative MPC over MPS. Guys, so 0.8 over 0.2, and remember it's a negative, okay? So that's going to give us a -4, and so what you could say is in absolute value terms, right, the spending multiplier is greater than the tax multiplier. And I would say in absolute value terms, right? So in absolute value terms, the spending multiplier is greater than the tax multiplier. You can do it either way, but both work for an explanation. That's D2. Let's go on to E. Assume that the government lowers income tax rates to eliminate the recessionary gap. Well, each of the following increase, decrease, or stay the same aggregate demand. Okay, so what's going to happen to aggregate demand if we lower income taxes? Well, for sure, guys, if we lower income taxes, disposable income is going to go up, consumption is going to go up, and plus we're going to get this multiplied impact, guys. Spending is going to increase. AD is total spending. Guys, that's our answer. It's pretty much our explanation too. So AD is going to increase. The explanation is when we lower personal income taxes, what's going to happen is disposable income is going to go up and consumption is going to go up. Consumption is part of AD, and plus we're going to get the multiplier effect too, which also gets AD to increase. So that's our explanation, our answer for E1. E2 is kind of a fun one, guys, because they're going to accept pretty much any answer as long as you can put your justifiable explanation here. So, long run aggregate supply. Here's the answer on this one. You could say nothing's going to happen in the long run aggregate supply. And here would be your reasoning. You would just say, look, this is what this is doing is increasing consumption, right? Spending. We're not really changing the quantity or the quality of the factors of production, so nothing's going to happen to economic growth. So LRAS is going to shift. But this is just simply focused on spending. It's not focused on the production side. That's acceptable. You could also say that long-run economic growth is going to increase. And remember I'm saying long-run economic growth, guys. I know it says LRAS, but a shift right in the LRAS is long-run economic growth. You can say we're going to get LRAS to shift right, that's economic growth. Why is that? Well, if we, once again, lower taxes, get more disposable income, we're going to get more savings, right? Like we already talked about, we're going to get savings. In fact, as we go around, we get more and more savings. That's going to drive the interest rate down, you could say. When the interest rate gets driven down, that's going to provide for more investment. And when we get more investment, that's going to provide for, guess what? An increase in LRAS. On top of that, you could go the supply-siders route, okay? There's some theory out there that says, known as, part of the supply-side theory that's out there is that when we lower personal income taxes, you're increasing the incentive to work. So if you increase the incentive to work, people want to work more hours. They'll want to work more. That would also cause the LRAS to shift to the right. So that's another way to go. But guess what? You can actually say LRAS. So we've already said you can say it's not going to change. You can say it's going to shift to the right. And guys, I think I've got it right. Okay, I want to do it from your orientation to the right. And then the final one is we could actually say LRAS is going to shift to the left. That's right. You could even say that. Why would that be the case? Well, if we lower taxes, guys, I think a lot of y'all are probably thinking that's a deficit, right? We're going to start running deficits. And when we run deficits, government's going to go to the financial market to borrow money. That's an increase in demand for loanable funds. They're competing with businesses for loanable funds now. They're going to drive the interest rate up. And guess what? Investment's going to decrease. And that decrease in investment is actually going to decrease LRAS. Don't love that last one because I think of that last one, it's not really decreasing LRAS. I think of it as decreasing the rate that LRAS is moving to the right, not actually in absolute terms moving it left. But like I said, guys, they actually accept all of those answers. So there's a lot of things that you could say for E2 on that tax change. Hope that made a little bit of sense to you. We'll see you in problem number 2.